I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France to introduce an address by the head of state.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam President. I now give the floor Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state and government. Last year, we met here in New York for our General Assembly, and at the time, I called upon each and every one of you to have the courage to construct peace and together to shoulder our responsibilities. That courage, I must say, has been more than put to a harsh test by the health, economic, social security shock, which is of unprecedented scope and immediate global crisis, the most immediate one since the creation of our organization 75 years ago. That courage, which from the very first was seen in those men and women who were on the front lines around the world and who still are to heal us, nourish us, accompany us, support us, and hold us, our healthcare and our humanitarian workers. And I want to first take these words to think of them. They expect that we commit and that we work together to build concrete responses together, because this crisis, no doubt, more than any other crisis, demands that we cooperate, demands that we invent new international solutions. First, I believe in science and knowledge, and humanity will overcome this pandemic. A cure will be found. But in that, as we await that moment, everyone knows that we must learn to live with the virus. We have no choice, and the world will learn that we have to live with a new reality which is imposed on all of us, which reveals our vulnerabilities, and which puts us before our immediate responsibilities. This new reality, this new world reality is clear, it's brutal, it's dizzying, and we must face it without falling into despair, without being discouraged, but be lucid as we face it. All of these challenges to which we are faced have been, in recent months, accentuated and exacerbated. The success achieved, or which has been impeded, and there has been much ground lost. The years of progress in fighting other diseases, infectious diseases such as HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, these are what we need to think of first and foremost. We have lagged behind now with them. 37 million people have fallen once again into abject poverty. Food insecurity is a serious threat and has increased. More than 1 billion students around the world have been affected by closing of schools in 160 countries, and 40 million children were not able to go to first grade and begin their education. Women have been at the forefront of an accumulation of all forms of violence against them, sexual, domestic, and gender-based violence. And given this and many other consequences linked to the pandemic, which has struck our planet and which continues to impact all continents, there is the fracturing of our means of collective action, which has accelerated. And while the only solution can come from our cooperation, the international organizations that we so very much need, the World Health Assembly, all have been accused by various of complacency, of being used by others. The third parties, scientific experts and journalists who were so important in to be able to understand what is happening and act effectively vis-a-vis the crisis, have all been called into question by states' propagandas and by the epidemic of disinformation. Our organization itself has run the risk of impotence. The United Nations Security Council, which is a guarantor of peace and stability, had a great difficulty in coming to an agreement on a humanitarian truce, which we've had to support with every part of our beings. Imagine that, to have so much trouble in agreeing on so little. But our permanent members were not able to, even with the exceptional circumstances, come together as we would like to have seen them do, because several have chosen to showcase their rivalry over the importance of collective effectiveness. All of these cracks which pre-existed the pandemic have led to a hegemonic collision of the powers, a calling into question of multilateralism or the use of it, trampling of international law. All of this is accelerated and deepened and is worsening global destabilization created by the pandemic. We cannot close our eyes. We don't have the right to close our eyes to this. We don't have the opportunity or the luxury to hesitate. This pandemic for our organization should serve as an electric shock, as a life-saving wake-up call. It's possible, given this trial, that there are motivations for hope as well. The European Union, beyond the predictions of division and impotence, worked in favor of the crisis and took a historic step of unity, of sovereignty, solidarity, a choice for the future. It is Europe, working with its African partners, which took the initiative of the G20 to help those most vulnerable countries to face the pandemic and to lighten the load of the debt burden, which weighs on their economies and endangers the very future of the continent. For the first time in the G20 finances, we enacted a moratorium on the debt of the poorest countries of Africa. It is Europe that is working with its partners, has made it possible to build the Act A initiative with the means to fight the pandemic and make it available to everyone. And it is Europe working with others that made it possible for the World Assembly of Health to draw the lessons of the pandemic and improve early warning alert systems. It is Europe working with its partners in Asia, America, and the Africas that had the energy to build and propose and bring solutions, solidarity, and action. We need to count on the strength of goodwill because today's world cannot be left to the rivalry between China and the United States, regardless of the weight in the world that these two great powers share, regardless of the history that ties us, especially to the United States. The crisis, the collapse of our frameworks of cooperation, the fragility I have just referenced, all of that means that we must build a new order, and it means that Europe needs to fully shoulder its responsibility. In other words, bring its values, its taste for the future, and it needs to know how to craft new solutions because we are not collectively condemned to a two-step dance, which to some extent would reduce everyone else to unfortunate spectators who are collectively impotent. We do have some leeway, and it's up to us to leverage it and to know how to define our priorities in this environment, to clearly make our choices and to forge new alliances. In the coming weeks, there are fundamental choices to be made, decisions to be taken before our people and before the international community. And these choices will have an immediate impact on the life of our nations, on the existence of our fellow citizens, on the running of the world. And we cannot hesitate here. We need to understand that when everything is shaky, that is the time that we need to get back to the basics. I deeply believe that since the very beginning of the COVID crisis, this is not a parenthesis that is opening and that will then close. It is a world beset by deep-seated crises, which are also due to our very interdependence. No doubt there will be a cure for the pandemic at some point, but there will be no miracle cure to the destructuring of the modern order. There will be no miracle cure for this paradox in which we live, one where our societies are so interdependent and at the same time where there's so much disagreement, where we are not in alignment with each other, where we're incapable of finding swift solutions. It's a situation where we ourselves are in a position where we might destroy the very framework of cooperation that we were able to create over recent decades. And that's why I want to say this before this assembly. The 5 main priorities for France, which France wants to build with its European partners, are first and foremost that with all powers of goodwill, that we need to work together to make sure that we are prepared and committed, that we lay the foundation for a new consensus that will make it possible to take specific action in the world as it currently stands. The first principle, the first goal is combating the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, which are the main threat to our collective security. The strategy of maximum pressure brought to bear over recent years has not made it possible to put an end to the destabilizing activities of Iran. And that's why France, and you will recall, is not the country that started the negotiations that led to the JCPOA agreement. But France and its partners, German and British partners, will maintain its requirement that the agreement be fully implemented, as well as the Vienna 2015 agreement, and will not accept Iran's breaches of this agreement. We will not compromise on the activation of a mechanism which the United States, and their own leader in exiting the agreement, was not able to activate. That would be to undermine the Security Council and the integrity of its decisions, and it would further exacerbate tensions in the region. But we do need to build a framework for useful action, as I was saying 2 years ago at this very General Assembly. It is up to us to fulfill the 2015 agreement, first in time and over time, to make sure that Iran never has access to a nuclear weapon, but also to ensure that we bring a response to Iran's ballistic activities and also to destabilization in the region. Turning to North Korea now, we have supported efforts undertaken by the United States of America to allow commitment and undertaking of negotiations. Even if tangible results have not yet been achieved, the initiative was important. And what we're looking for now is specific gestures of commitment and engagement by North Korea. It needs to comply with the Security Council resolutions quickly and in good faith. It needs to commit to a denuclearization process which is complete, verifiable, and irreversible. It's the only way to achieve a political solution, lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula. This is unavoidable for the purposes of stability and regional security, and it's also unavoidable for international peace and security. Likewise, we will not tolerate chemical weapons being used in Europe, Russia, or Syria. On behalf of collective security, I restate here to Russia that light needs to be shed on the assassination attempt against a political opponent using a neurotoxic agent, Novichok. This clarification needs to take place quickly and without fault, because we will enforce our red lines. And on this topic, France has always been prepared to enforce the effectiveness of red lines, or at least since I've been President of the Republic. Our collective security is also about combating terrorism everywhere where that is necessary. France was affected several years ago in a repeated manner, affected by terrorism on our soil, in our flesh, affected by terrorist acts which sometimes were fomented in the very heart and epicenter of Islamist terrorism. And here I am thinking specifically of the attacks of 2015 conceived in Syria. This is why France will always be strongly engaged in the Middle East and supporting Iraqi sovereignty, and will stand at the side of its partners in the Sahel. In the Levant, we will continue to be committed alongside the international coalition. We have enjoyed a first victory, the end of the territorial caliphate. But that victory is not the end of the war in the region. We will continue to fight against terrorists in the context of international coalitions and alongside our regional partners. And I want to recall here the role of the Kurd combatants in Syria alongside the coalition fighting Daesh and its terrorists. And I want to here again also recall the essential role played by Iraq and Iraqis, and a role that they will continue to play in this struggle. This is why France supports with strength all initiatives that Iraq is undertaking today, and will continue to do so for its sovereignty and its role in the fight against terrorism. In the Sahel, as you know, France is deeply committed alongside the 5 Sahel states, and the summits of Po and then the summit of Nouakchott allowed us to lay the foundation for a coalition to strengthen the fight in the region against our 2 enemies, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. These 2 organizations have recently suffered unprecedented setbacks, and it has made it possible to focus on the 3 frontier zones and EIGS zones, which led to tangible and unequaled results. We will continue our work with the support of Barkhane and our European and American partners. The armies of the G5 Sahel have managed to take back the advantage and resume a position that had been lost before. This momentum must continue. And it's along these lines that we'd also like to recall a truth here seen in recent weeks, and that is that democracy and the fight against terrorism go hand in hand. These two struggles are inseparable. Only democracy and justice, the rule of law and development will bring lasting peace back to the Sahel. What erupted in Mali under these principles cannot now be betrayed. We must put Mali back on the irreversible path towards a return to civilian power and the organization of elections quickly. France, like its African partners more specifically, can only remain committed under one condition. I state this, and I state it very clearly. France is present on Malian soil, as it's present on other soil countries in the region, at the request of sovereign states and regional organizations. The very minute where these states wish to see our departure or wish to fight terrorism alone, we will withdraw. And thus, reiteration of that request, the need that I have asked for in Pau and then Nouakchott, which was then reconfirmed by the governing junta in Mali. And on this topic, we will remain very vigilant. We believe in the sovereignty of people, and we believe that our action against terrorism can be useful and lasting only if we define the priorities and sovereignty, and if we work towards a bold solution together, collectively. Libya. The crisis has had a profound impact on regional stability and work exacerbated by external interference. The second priority, in my eyes, in coming months for Libya, is the demanding construction of peace and stability while respecting equal sovereignty of peoples. The grammar of peace and stability needs to be redefined because the lines have moved due to the crisis, but actually even before. The American withdrawal, which was supposed to be a last resort guarantor in a system that has been exceeded, and other powers exerting their power, projection of China out beyond its borders, the strengthening of European sovereignties, all of these deeper trends need to lead us to rethink our collective commitments to guarantee peace and security. The principle of action in this area needs to be clear, and our hand must not tremble in enforcing the respect of sovereignty of peoples, the rule of law, means of action, the demands and responsibilities to ensure effective implementation of decisions undertaken under the auspices of the United Nations. That's exactly what we are doing in Lebanon, where the aspirations of the Lebanese sovereign people need to be respected, heard, and supported, regardless of the misguided ways of the Lebanese political class. And here I must restate my full support for the Lebanese people and my determination to act where I am and in full respect and support of the Lebanese people, with demanding friendship, as I often say, so that life can be improved, and also so that the path towards peace and democracy, which is more effective, can be found. But Lebanon is a treasure for all of humanity. It's a treasure because it's a kind of exception of democracy and pluralism in a region which is pushed around by terrorism and hegemonic powers. The United Nations needs to specifically, as it did as it's done in the past and over time, it needs to be committed alongside civil society and NGOs to meet the immediate needs and undertake reconstruction. Syria. The resumption of talks in Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations is a positive step, but the process cannot be limited just to drafting a new constitution. It needs to also include transparent, regular, and free elections and respect the aspirations and sovereignty of the Syrian people. France and its European partners will thus continue to tie financing of reconstruction and normalization of relations with Damascus, tie it to a credible political solution a lasting solution. It's the only way to eradicate terrorism in the region. Peace in the Middle East is a need. It's a requirement, first for the Israelis and the Palestinians, but for all of us. I am pleased that Israel has obtained recognition by 2 new Arab states. It's legitimate recognition. It's also a gauge of hope for the future. But still, lasting and fair peace, first and foremost, requires decisive negotiations that will allow Palestinians to finally enjoy their rights. There is no alternative to courageous negotiations, which will in turn require an agreement on the most thorny issues, while respecting the legitimate aspirations of each side and in the full recognition of and security and sovereignty of each. I do not believe in a peace that would be built on hegemony or humiliation, or even less if it were to be compensated by money. Because we know too much. We know that humiliation cannot be compensated by money for a people. It's up to us then, collectively, to work towards a bold solution. In Libya now, the crisis has henceforth had a deep-seated impact on regional stability and been worsened by external interference. Libya, in our eyes, is the perfect illustration of errors that can take place when we do not respect the sovereignty of people. No power can build the well-being of a people unless it's wished so itself and built it itself through transition as it desired. Also, we need to make choices very specifically, as is done in Europe, to effectively respect the embargo or arms embargo decided by the United Nations. This embargo has been violated by a number of powers, and that is not sustainable. A number of powers have continued to import combatants from the Syrian theater, thereby exporting terrorism to the region, despite the interests of Libya, despite the interests of the Sahel neighbors or Europe. Collectively, we have been too silent about these actions, and we need to speak up much more in the coming weeks. We're working together with our partners in the neighboring countries of Libya in order to obtain a lasting ceasefire and then to start a process which will allow for the peaceful resolution of conflict under the auspices of the United Nations. It's France's initiative to lead in coming weeks to work with the Secretary General of the United Nations to bring together all the neighboring countries of Libya. This recommitment of the neighboring countries is necessary over the term.
In the Eastern Mediterranean, we have to commit to an effective, clear dialogue to avoid a new space of confrontation which would jeopardize international law. The Mediterranean countries of the European Union have spoken clearly in favour for this, as they did a few days ago in Ajaccio. We respect Turkey. We are ready for dialogue with her. But we expect her to respect European sovereignty, international law, and to provide clarification about her action in Libya and in Syria. Insults are fruitless. And all of these words and all of these acts only have a place in responsible relations, well, do not have a place in responsible relations between states. Calling for responsibility is what we need. We as Europeans are ready for dialogue and for the indispensable the construction of a Pax Mediterranea, but not at the price of intimidation, might is right, and so on. What we need is respect for international law and cooperation, respect between allies. When it comes to the Ukrainian crisis, the Normandy format has allowed us, with the German Chancellor, to make some progress. But the situation in Belarus brings with it the risk of a new fracture in our continent. The courage of the Belarusian people brings the admiration of all. These aspirations should be respected, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with them. And I want to put that quite strongly. A national political dialogue should be set up, and any meddling from outside should be avoided. Together with the Chancellor of Germany and with the President of the Council, we had the opportunity to talk to President Putin and to advocate for the mediation as proposed by the OSCE. We see no other option. We say no to intervention, no to guilty silence. Europe also must be up to its responsibilities, to its history and its geography. But believing in peace and stability in our region also means wanting to build for the continent of Europe a new paradigm of some kind for a sustainable stability. And this cannot be reduced to historic agreements, nor ultimately to the dismantling of those agreements that we have seen in recent years. When we talk about peace, stability and collective security for Europe, I cannot avoid today the fact that we are living in a situation where our security and stability very largely depended on agreements that were signed in the past between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and that these agreements have been progressively dismantled over the last 10 years. The end of the INF Treaty marked an important step that we must address. This is why I hope that we Europeans can recommit to a complete and ambitious discussion with all of our neighbours for our collective security, and to build the new paradigm which will take into account the end of these historic treaties. I put this also very clearly. We cannot delegate our collective security to other powers outside Europe. Thirdly, we must protect our common goods. This is our shared responsibility and goes beyond our national interests or our regional balances. Protecting our common goods does not run counter to our sovereignty. It is rather the only way for us to really maintain it by keeping control of our own destiny. This is exactly what the crisis that we are going through shows us once again in incontestable fashion. The health of one person in the face of an epidemic is the health of all, and we have a unique opportunity to make the means of combating the pandemic public goods at global level that everybody should have access to. This is the rationale behind our action within Act A, and which we will aim to roll out in the coming months over a number of areas, including strengthening healthcare systems. Health is a public good, a global public good. That's a battle that we have waged in recent years and that we also carried out in Lyon when it was a question of remobilizing the international community to finance the fight against epidemics in the past. And this is what we will continue to do. And we must do this even more forcefully in the months to come. The climate and biodiversity must also be at the heart of our collective agenda, not in words but in actions. In December, it will be 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, and we already know that the objectives that we set collectively will not be achieved. The response to the pandemic can change everything. The recovery plans adopted across broad scales in many countries are a historic opportunity for us to transform our economies and development. This should be at the heart of the ambition of the European Union, and I thank the President of the Commission for her commitment. This must be at the heart of our work in the G7 and the G20. It's essential, and so this is also why I would like France to mark the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement by once again mobilizing the international community, so that each of us can look at where we are on our commitments without changing the measurement, if you like, or without any obfuscation or confusion, but by remobilizing our countries and our regions in total transparency, but in a spirit that is proactive. Europe will reach an agreement in the coming weeks to address its aim for carbon neutrality by 2050. The President of the European Commission set the target of reducing greenhouse gases by at least 55% in 2030. This means we need to work more quickly and more powerfully on an ambitious emissions trading system, a minimum price for carbon and a carbon border tax. These measures constitute a totality between themselves. One will not be as effective without the others. Alongside our British and European partners, we will look for commitments from the large emitters with a view to COP26, and we will be alongside our partners to meet their objectives. The meeting in December will be essential in this respect. In November, we will meet in Paris with the development banks to ensure that financial flows contribute to an a recovery that is environmentally friendly and in solidarity. On biodiversity, whose links with climate change and human health have already been established, we will organise a meeting in Marseille with the United Nations, the World Bank. It will be a one-planet summit that will allow us to build an agenda of specific actions on protected areas at land and at sea, agroecology, financing for biodiversity and the fight against deforestation, as well as the protection of ecosystems and species. The oceans and seas, the poles, and the tropical forests belong to humanity's global heritage. We should protect them, and we will do this in view of the decisive deadlines that have been set for the United Nations through the COP conferences on the climate, biodiversity and the fight against desertification. In order to meet our deadlines, I propose that a summit be organised next year in New York in advance of these three COP conferences to give them a decisive impetus and to reach tangible results. The digital space is also a common good, a unique common good, open and trusting, which should be subject to new governance so that it is not captured, pirated or instrumentalised. This is the rationale behind the initiatives that we are carrying out through the Information and Democracy Partnership of the Christchurch Appeal, as well as on the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. We should consolidate each of these partnerships and make progress on the Akaba process. Here I welcome the commitment of the Prime Minister of New Zealand as well as the King of Jordan on this agenda. These are now specific actions, but above all now we need not only commitments but also actions from the large operators, actions from the large-scale platforms, and commitment from all to legislate and to regulate at regional level in order to meet our commitments. The fight against hatred, the fight against terrorism, the creation, ultimately, of a public order on the internet are as important as in technological innovation and freedom, because there can be no freedom without public order. We need international commitment, and I don't think that the protection of the freedom of expression can accommodate terrorist discourse, hate speech, or the anonymity that in some way covers for a lack of inhibition in violence. This agenda is essential so that for all of us, and we will continue to work on it powerfully. Finally, and I say this in a context which is that marked by the epidemic, education is an essential common good that we will continue to commit to in the years to come. Hundreds of millions of our young people have left education because of the epidemic, but education, in particular the education of girls, continues to be a priority, particularly in Africa. Side by side with President Macky Sall, we are committed to the Global Partnership for Education. We have raised new funds to finance the actions within this partnership. The role today of the World Bank, the United Nations, the Global Partnership for Education, UNESCO, the role also of our bilateral actions should be strengthened to work more effectively in the months and years to come to improve education, in particular for girls. This fight is not over, far from it, and we will not forget it. It is at the heart of France's commitment on defence and to fight for global public goods. Our fourth priority is building a new era of globalization. The first era of globalization was opened by the journeys of Christopher Columbus and of Magellan, the era of discovery, the first invasions as well, of a kind of trial and error, a kind of fascination and, on occasion, of mutual misunderstanding. The second was the era of colonial empires and the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. This was globalization through trade, the first openings, but also slave routes, exploitation, development of some, and the enslavement of others, the first movements of the population, and a recomposition of our world along the line of these dominations. The third era began in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening of borders, the creation of a belief in the possibility that the circulation of goods and people, and then the generalization of the internet, could lead to a convergence of interests, values, and ideas. Ultimately, it is in this era of globalization, which I am galloping through, that we could separate each of these eras into different periods, but it is this third which has been challenged for 10 years now, because the deep conviction, the teleology that accompanied it, was that this globalization would be the globalization of peace, a rapprochement of values, a universalization of respect for the other. And it has been challenged because the financial crisis, the transformations in the world, the return of peoples, national consciences, and ultimately because of the global pandemic. It's also been challenged by a deep crisis, the crisis in the middle classes in the West, which at some moment feared that this new order, that some had called a happy globalization, they feared what it might bring them. These middle classes, which above all in the West, have often been part of economic and cultural variables of this world that is thus open. So we cannot deny everything that this period has brought in terms of progress, all of that this third era of the mobilization has allowed us to bring in terms of prosperity. It has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty precisely by the redistributions brought about by trade and global production. And openness has allowed us to be aware of the journeys and the circularization that has in part brought peace to our relations. And it would be dangerous to close ourselves into a kind of generalized protectionism through customs and through trade wars in a space of doubt that would lead us to close down, or to give into a logic of power, because we can see that this crisis cannot be solved through turning in on nationalism or the violence of populism or extremism, or by the return to thinking only of power. But it is clear that the chains of value at global level need to be rethought today, because the crisis has shown that the dependence of strategic sectors such as healthcare, the digital sector, artificial intelligence, and food can jeopardize the free exercise of sovereignty. But we also have seen that there are good dependencies, and there are dependencies also alongside those that make us fragile. We need to keep international trade and openness, because it is good for us in economic and social terms, and because we cannot bring everything back into an internal level, and also because of the dependencies that are imposed by cooperation. But the complete dependence on some powers, whether these are technological, food or industrial, create vulnerabilities which will not allow us to establish the balances that go hand in hand with our global world. Finally, the inequalities in this new global order are also unsustainable. We have brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in certain countries. We have reduced some of the north-south inequalities, but we have created inequalities within our countries. And this new order makes these things unsustainable in democratic terms. We've also created a globalization of conscience, which is today a globalization not of the knowledge that underlies the internet, but it's become the globalization of emotion and resentment. In each of these crises, we have to provide a response. It is this strategy that the European Union is trying to come up with, as are other powers. It is essential that our international rules are adapted to take account of these new realities, and that they give us the means for international cooperation that is balanced and that respects the sovereignty of each to the benefit of all. The fight against inequality should very clearly be at the heart of our new globalization. France has provided initiatives that have brought results in female entrepreneurship, global partnership on education, health for all, the fight against inequality, but we have to go further. In some way, as you can certainly see, the world that we live in is based on an academic consensus that has become a political consensus and a consensus in the market, what we often call the Washington consensus. It has survived. We need to lay the foundations of a globalization that is fairer, more balanced, more equitable, and more lasting. We must think of the terms for a globalization that it can rethink the terms of a fair sovereignty and of fair trade, which integrates at the heart of its being the fight against inequalities in all of their forms, whether because of gender, the economy, the fight against climate change, and for biodiversity, which allows us in lasting fashion to integrate a new global balance. Here again we can make specific proposals in a few weeks at the Paris Forum. The work begun with the European Commission, the International Monetary Fund, and many other powers in good faith will be essential. Africa, with Europe, will be the driver for this redefinition of globalization. That is why we will continue our efforts as part of the initiative that we have built to help African countries to face the pandemic in health, economic, social and humanitarian terms. November's G20 will be decisive in implementing a debt moratorium that we have acted for, and also to go further. We must also better support the immense energy of civil society, of the young people in Africa who are its power and its future. This is the rationale behind the initiatives that we will produce in the coming months with the diasporas and with the support and in supporting the African private sector. Finally, the fifth objective that I would here like to propose for our collective is respect for international humanitarian law and the fundamental rights of each person. I believe that this is essential to the very survival of our organisation. Indeed, in this area we've seen a series of setbacks and very often too much silence. Since the creation of by the United Nations of a global humanitarian day, 5,000 workers have been attacked and 1,800 have been murdered. Last year was the deadliest. And I have a particular thought for those young French men and women who within the organisation acted, were working exactly in this framework in Niger, and who were killed in terrible conditions last August. The United Nations cannot remain inactive in the face of this regression. This is why, with French NGOs and with our international partners, we are building an initiative to ensure the effectiveness of international law, the protection of humanitarian personnel, and the fight against impunity. The humanitarian space is a common legacy that we have to protect by guaranteeing access for civilians and for the personnel who support them to protection. We have seen setbacks here. We've also seen the practices, including by permanent members of the Security Council, of unacceptable action, in particular in Syria. The neutrality of humanitarian action needs to be respected, and we must prevent it from being criminalised. Taking on our responsibilities in the humanitarian sector is also evidence of our solidarity and our humanity, and this also must be addressed when it comes to migration. The situation in Greece at Moria is very difficult. France, alongside Germany and its partners, will take on its responsibilities in hosting refugees, and we must act together to manage migration flows, to end human trafficking, to end crossings that lead to death, and to end people being compelled to take on these journeys. This will be at the heart of our European agenda in the coming weeks. I'll have the opportunity to come back to this. We must intensify our fight against traffickers and must meet our responsibilities. Finally, fundamental rights are not a Western idea that we can oppose as an intervention on all those that refer to them. They are the principles of our organisation that are enshrined in the text that the members of the United Nations freely consented to and signed up to respect. That is the reason why, in particular, France has asked for an international mission under the aegis of the United Nations to go to Xinjiang to take into account the concerns that we have collectively about the situation of the Uyghur Muslim minority. We also cannot tolerate that 25 years after the Beijing conference, the rights of women are also seeing a deep setback, and for that reason, next summer we will organise the Forum Generation Equality with UN Women and with civil society for the emancipation of all, education of girls, and the real and effective exercising of human rights. These are the 5 principles on which France wishes to build the foundations of an international order. so that the foundations of our organization are not shaken by this pandemic. On the contrary, we have to take change by the hand before it takes us by the neck, as Winston Churchill said. This requires the establishment of international cooperation that is functional, based on clear, defined rules respected by all. Multilateralism is not just an act of faith, it is an operational necessity. No country can manage this challenge alone. International cooperation can be difficult, but it is an objective imperative. That said, we can no longer content ourselves with a multilateralism in words, which allows us to just agree on some lowest common denominator as a way of masking our deep divergences behind a facade. We have to change the method and also be clear that that we have to agree to alliances and principles. Multilateralism in this modern world should also involve international organizations, private stakeholders, businesses, the NGOs, researchers, and citizens, so that each is a true stakeholder in the actions we commit to. It should be built on a solid basis that is respected and verified between partners in good faith around clear objectives and rules, with a true responsibility and accountability mechanisms. That is why, at the Paris Peace Forum in November, we will make an effort alongside our European and African partners, and with all those who wish to in Asia, America and elsewhere, to lay the foundations of this new international consensus to the benefit of the future of our organization. I don't believe in some grand day of refoundation. I believe in determined, methodical, rigorous work to build a modern international order which will allow us to spare future generations this scourge of war, to reaffirm human rights and equality between nations, to promote social progress in greater freedom. That is the very promise of our Charter. It is highly timely. I believe in the power of will, in the value of sincerity and of courage. And in talking to you at this time, despite the distance created across our screens, I have in memory the face of a Lebanese girl who I met a few days ago, who had lost everything, but who vowed to fight for everything that she believed in. It's also the memory of those young French citizens killed in Niger because they believed in a world of humanity, solidarity and fraternity. It's the same memory that many of you will certainly have, and which obliges us to act, and which prevents us from falling into cynicism, which requires us to act, and that prevents us from giving into discouragement or facile solutions. There are lives, above all, there are boys and girls who are committed around the world because they believe in our words, because they live for and by our principles. If we betray them, we are those who are the most guilty for their disillusionment and the fact that they lose everything. So it is up to us to act. I know that we are able. In any case, we will do everything that we can, and I know that many colleagues are also ready. I am counting on each person among you. Thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the French Republic for the statement just made. We have heard the last speaker and then the General